The letter was old, the ink faded, but the name Leontius stood out like a beacon in a dark sea of forgotten words. It was a name that echoed through the halls of history, a name that hinted at secrets and kinship, a name that could unravel the tangled web of a powerful family from the late Roman Empire, Leontius. The name was not just a label. It was a clue, a piece of a puzzle that historians like Matthiessen had been trying to solve for decades. Matthiessen believed that unique names, or late namen as he called them, were often passed down within families. It was a way to keep the family line alive, to ensure that the name lived on through generations, and Leontius, it seemed, was one such name. The story of Leontius began with a man named Ruricius, a bishop who lived in the 5th century. Ruricius was a man of letters, a man of the church, and a man who left behind a treasure trove of letters that provided a glimpse into his world. In one of these letters, Ruricius mentioned a son named Leontius. This was a crucial piece of evidence. Matthiessen argued that Leontius was more than just a name. He was part of Ruricius's family, but the story didn't end there. The more Matthiessen delved into Ruricius's correspondence, the more questions arose. Bruno Crush, the editor of Ruricius's letters, had a different take. Crush believed that only the first 3 of Ruricius's supposed sons, Amatius, Eparchius, and Constantius, were truly his children. The last 2, Aurelianus and Leontius, he thought, might have been grandchildren or even nephews. The evidence was murky, and Matthiessen knew it. One of the key letters was to Bishop Victorinus of Phrygia, where Ruricius sent our 2 lights, Duo Lumina Nostra Aurelianus and Leontius, along with a request for prayers. The language Ruricius used was affectionate, but it didn't definitively prove a blood relationship. Was it possible that Aurelianus and Leontius were simply spiritual sons, favored by Ruricius in his role as a bishop? The most compelling evidence for Leontius being Ruricius's son came from another letter, this one to a man named Constantius. Ruricius addressed Constantius as his son, and scolded him for his adolescent dissoluteness. He begged Constantius to pay attention to God and his parents, rather than indulging in songs and rowdiness. The personal, parental tone of the letter suggested a close carnal relationship. There was even a third letter to a Lord Constantius, written with a formal politeness that hinted at a more mature relationship, possibly after Constantius had grown up. But even this wasn't enough to prove everything. Ruricius's affection for his sons, particularly Eparchius and Amatius, was evident in his letters. Both sons had become priests and served under Bishop Aprunculus in Clermont. When Eparchius got into trouble, Ruricius intervened, writing to Aprunculus with a mix of fatherly concern and diplomatic finesse. He admitted that he was moved by the affection of consanguinity, and urged Aprunculus to show mercy. Eparchius, it seemed, had a knack for getting into trouble, and Gregory of Tours later wrote that he once celebrated Christmas Eve Mass drunk, making neighing sounds at the altar. Amatius, on the other hand, appeared to be Ruricius's favorite. Ruricius wrote to him as his sweetest and unanimous son, asking him to remember him in his prayers and to visit soon. The relationship between father and son had matured over time, and Ruricius addressed Amatius with a mix of respect and affection, reminding him of the father who taught, raised, and with the Lord's help, led you into the priesthood. But the story of Ruricius's family wasn't just about blood ties. It was about the network of relationships that defined his world. Ruricius used the term germanitas, brotherhood, frequently, not just to describe his biological relationships, but to express deep spiritual connection. He wrote to Nematius and Saronia, who became related to him by the marriage of his son to their daughter, addressing them as most devoted lords and brothers in Christ. The term germanitas was Ruricius's way of conveying intimacy and solidarity, whether with family, friends, or fellow clerics. Ruricius's letters to Bishop Euphrasia, the priest Albinus, and Bishop Aprunculus all used germanitas to express a bond of friendship and mutual respect. When his daughter-in-law tragically died, Ruricius wrote to Nematius and Saronia, mourning the loss of a daughter who had been the solace of life, the hope of posterity, ornament of the familia, joy of the heart. He feared that the bond of brotherhood had been broken, but he hoped that their spiritual connection would endure. For Ruricius, kinship was more than just blood. It was a web of relationships shaped by his role as a bishop and his commitment to the church. Jesus, he believed, was the only son by nature, and all who followed Christ were adopted into a divine family, becoming brothers and heirs of God. This transcendent vision of kinship defined the world Ruricius inhabited, a world where the bonds of friendship and faith were as strong, if not stronger, than the bonds of blood. And so, the name Leontius remained a mystery, a clue that pointed to a family whose ties were as complex and multifaceted as the world they lived in. The story of Ruricius and his family was a story of love, faith, and the enduring power of relationships, both carnal and spiritual. Avitus, a bishop in the early 500s, wrote a special poem called De Consolatoria to his brother Apollinaris. He started the poem with a letter, explaining that it was a very personal work about their family's religious roots and the holy women in their family. Avitus was worried about sharing something so personal, but he believed the poem could offer spiritual guidance if it was read by the right people, those connected by family or faith. In the poem, Avitus focused on the story of his sister, Faustina, who became a nun. He described her as a key figure in their family, even though she was the youngest. Faustina's mother, Audentia, dedicated both herself and her daughter to a life of devotion to Christ. Avitus compared Audentia to the biblical mother who offered her son as a sacrifice, emphasizing Faustina's importance not just to her family, but to the broader spiritual community. As Faustina grew older, her spiritual maturity impressed everyone. Avitus compared her to the young Samuel, who became a priest, and to other biblical figures known for their faith and courage. Audentia encouraged Faustina to follow the path of other holy women in their family, like Severiana, Aspidia, and another Faustina, who all chose a life of religious service. Avitus also highlighted how Faustina's dedication inspired her brothers to follow a religious path. He wrote that even though she was born later, she led the way in embracing a life of faith. He praised her for choosing a life of purity, free from the hardships of marriage and childbirth, and for taking Christ as her spouse. To comfort Faustina and encourage her in her religious journey, Avitus drew on the stories of strong biblical women like Mary, who was both a virgin and the mother of Jesus, and other heroines like Ruth, Susanna, and Judith. He emphasized that women, just like men, could achieve great things through faith and courage. He even mentioned Eugenia, a woman who dressed as a man to become an abbot, showing that women could be just as strong and capable as men in serving God. Avitus's poem also celebrated the family's religious heritage. He talked about their grandparents and great-grandparents who were priests and bishops, and he encouraged Faustina to pray for her brothers, including himself and Apollinaris, so that they could all be part of the church's fellowship. He saw Faustina as a new kind of leader in the family, one who embodied the values of faith and service, much like a paterfamilias, the traditional head of a Roman family. In his letters to Apollinaris, Avitus further explored the idea of family and faith. He spoke of their shared history and the legacy of their ancestor, Sidonius Apollinaris, who was known for his holiness. Avitus saw the family's success not just in terms of worldly achievements, but in their spiritual contributions. He believed that while Apollinaris could carry on the family's secular legacy, it was his own role as a religious leader that would ensure the family's eternal salvation. Through his writings, Avitus crafted a vision of family that blended the personal and the spiritual, placing their lineage within the broader story of the Church and Christian history. This vision reflected a deep belief in the importance of faith and the connections between family, community, and the divine order. Gregory of Tours, a bishop and historian who lived in the 6th century, wrote a lot about the history and saints of his time. His works are filled with stories that mix personal and local history with a broader Christian view of the world. For Gregory, history was not just a series of events. It was a story of God's guidance and the unfolding of divine plans. Gregory's most famous work is his Histories, where he describes the events of his own time and connects them to the Christian past. He wrote about the lives of saints, especially those from Roman and post-Roman Gaul, and the miracles they performed. One of his most significant works is about the miracles of Saint Martin, a famous bishop of Tours, and Saint Julian, a saint from his homeland, the Auvergne. Gregory believed that history was a way to see God's plan in action. He thought that the lives of saints and the events of the past were all part of a larger, sacred story. For example, he wrote about the life of the fathers, where he explained why he used the singular life instead of the plural lives when talking about the saints. He said it was because, Even though each saint had different virtues and merits, they all shared one common life, just as all people share the same world. When Gregory looked at the world around him, he saw it as a place shaped by the stories of martyrs, holy men and women, and righteous bishops. He believed that the countryside was full of forgotten Christian heroes, and their relics and artifacts often appeared suddenly, revealing their stories. Some people might wonder if these stories were real or if Gregory imagined them, but it's more likely that he was telling stories that were already part of the local culture and traditions. Gregory was not sentimental about the Roman Empire. He often portrayed it as a place that persecuted Christians, and even the famous Christian Emperor Constantine was described as violent. Instead, Gregory connected the history of Gaul to the broader Christian history developed by earlier writers like Eusebius, Jerome, and Ruricius. He saw the beginning of creation as the start of Christ and the Church, and he traced the history of Christianity from Adam to Jesus, and then to the martyrs and early bishops of Gaul. Gregory understood that early Christianity in Gaul was often established through the support of individual patrons. The first bishops of Tours, for example, came from different backgrounds. Some were sent by the Pope, some were local townspeople, and others were soldiers. They were often buried outside of towns or in the countryside, which is why many of their graves were rediscovered in the 6th century. As time went on, the history of the 5th century in Gregory's writings became more focused on aristocrats who became bishops. These bishops began to build grand churches, often using their wealth to support the church instead of funding public buildings like baths and arenas. For example, the first bishops of Tours from noble families like Eustachius and Perpetuus built large churches and left their estates to the church. Gregory's understanding of history and kinship was deeply tied to the church. He saw the succession of bishops as a part of God's plan. Unlike some historians who focus on family lines, Gregory saw his family as part of a larger Christian community. His relatives, both blood relations and those connected through the church, were important to him, but he rarely talked about them in the way we might expect. He was more interested in how they fit into the larger story of salvation. For example, Gregory claimed descent from Vitius Epigetus, a martyr from the 2nd century. He mentioned Vitius in his histories, but didn't directly say he was his ancestor. It took some detective work to figure out that Gregory's father, Leontius, was the son of Georgius, who was related to Vitius. Gregory's mother's family was also important, but he didn't always make it clear how they were related. He had to explain these connections through different stories and references in his works. Gregory's relatives, like his maternal uncle Nistus and his brother Peter, were often mentioned in the context of their involvement with holy figures and miracles. When his brother Peter was killed, Gregory used their connections to holy men to defend Peter's reputation. He also mentioned that his family had a long history of being connected to the bishops of Tours, which was a way to show their importance in the church. Overall, Gregory's view of history and kinship was deeply rooted in his faith. He saw the world through the lens of the church and the lives of saints, and he believed that everything in history was part of God's plan. His works are a rich tapestry of stories that blend the personal, the local, and the divine, offering a unique window into the world of 6th century Gaul. In the world of late antique Gaul, friendship and family ties were incredibly important. These relationships helped people navigate the complex social and political landscape of the time. One of the key figures in this world was Sidonius Apollinaris, a prominent Gallo-Roman aristocrat and bishop who lived in the 5th century. Through his letters and poetry, we can see how relationships were formed and maintained during this period of transition from the Roman Empire to the early medieval world. Sidonius often wrote to his friends and acquaintances, using his letters to discuss various topics, from personal matters to political affairs. In one of his letters, he mentions a place called Tribus Villae, where he advises his correspondent to seek out a person named Thaumastus. Sidonius mentions that Thaumastus has 2 houses, and the younger one is his friend. This shows how personal connections and visits to friends were a common part of life in late antique Gaul. Another letter from Sidonius discusses the importance of showing respect to elders. He advises his friend to bow low and salute an older person, almost like an uncle. This kind of respect for older family members and friends was a significant part of social etiquette. Friendship in late antique Gaul was not just about personal bonds. It was also a way to maintain and strengthen social and political networks. Ralph Mathieson, a historian, has written extensively on this topic. He notes that in the 5th century, Roman aristocrats in Gaul had to adapt to the changing political landscape, where barbarian tribes were becoming more influential. Maintaining strong friendships and family ties was crucial for survival and success. Sidonius's letters also reveal the importance of family connections. For example, he writes about his cousin Avitus, mentioning that their mothers were related by the highest tie of blood. This kind of close family connection was common among the Gallo-Roman aristocracy, and it helped to solidify their social status and influence. The use of specific terms to describe family relationships is also interesting. Sidonius and other writers of the time used words like germanus, brother, and frater, brother, frequently, but these terms could sometimes refer to close friends as well as blood relatives. This shows that the lines between family and friendship were often blurred, and both types of relationships were valued equally. One of the key figures in this network was Ruricius, who became the bishop of Limoges. Ruricius wrote many letters, and in one of them he addresses a man named Leontius as his brother. This use of brother could indicate a close friendship or a spiritual bond, as many clergy members referred to each other as brothers. The transition from Roman to Frankish rule in Gaul was a significant period of change. Historians like Bernhard Jussen and Conrad Walter have studied how the Gallo-Roman aristocracy adapted to the new Frankish elite. They found that many bishops and other leaders in the church came from families with strong Roman roots, and they used their family connections to maintain their influence in the new political order. For example, Ruricius, who was from a prominent Gallo-Roman family, became a bishop and used his position to help his friends and family. He wrote letters to other clergy members and to influential figures, often addressing them as brother or sister. This kind of language reinforced the idea that the church was a family, and that all members were part of a larger community. The concept of family in late antique Gaul was complex and multifaceted. Isidore of Seville, a 7th century historian, described different types of family relationships, such as agnates, those descended from the same male line, and cognates, those related through both male and female lines. These distinctions were important in Roman law and in the social structure of the time. Despite the importance of family ties, the use of specific terms like uterine, half-brother or half-sister was rare in the literature of the period. This suggests that the Gallo-Roman aristocracy placed more emphasis on broader family connections and friendships, rather than on detailed genealogical distinctions. In his letters, Ruricius often mentioned his close friends and the books he borrowed from them. For example, he wrote to Sidonius about a book he had borrowed, quoting from a letter by Jerome, a famous Christian writer. This shows how the exchange of books and ideas was a key part of intellectual and social life in late antique Gaul. Overall, the letters and writings of figures like Sidonius and Ruricius provide a fascinating glimpse into the world of late antique Gaul. They show how friendships and family ties were essential for navigating the complex social and political landscape of the time. These relationships were not just about personal bonds, but were also a way to maintain influence and status in a rapidly changing world. As the 7th century dawned, the landscape of post-Roman Gaul was changing in profound ways. The groups that had defined the late and post-Roman periods, like the powerful episcopal families, were fading into the mist of time. By the time Gregory of Tours died in 594, his family's legacy seemed to vanish with him. Even the once prominent families like the Apollinaires and Ovidi, who had been so influential, began to fade after 700. This shift was not just a matter of fading names. It was a transformation in the very way people thought about family and power. One example of this change is the story of Bishop Avitus of Clermont and his brother Bonitus. In the late 7th century, Bonitus took over the episcopal seat of Clermont, a position once held by another Avitus in Gregory's day. However, Bonitus's story is more complex. After just a decade, he left the bishopric, reportedly because he was upset by the simoniacal nepotism of his own succession. Instead of continuing as a bishop, he chose a monastic life, traveling to Rome and eventually dying in Lyons around 705. His body was later moved to the Auvergne, and a monk wrote a life of Bonitus, highlighting his spiritual journey. This shift from an episcopal to a monastic life was a sign of the changing times, where new institutions were reshaping how people thought about family and power. This transformation is part of a larger story about the emergence of the Frankish aristocracy. The Frankish aristocracy, centered in northern Gaul and closely tied to the Merovingian kings, began to take shape in the late 5th century. However, it wasn't until the 7th century that their kindreds became more visible. Chris Wickham, a historian, has gathered clues that suggest a powerful Frankish aristocracy in the north, bound to the king with significant rural assets. This visibility is partly due to the types of sources that have survived from this period, such as charters and royal diplomas. Before 600, such documents were rare, but they become more common as the 7th century progresses. One of the most significant changes was the rise of monasticism. By 700, over 550 monasteries had been established in the Frankish kingdoms, with 320 of them founded in the 7th century alone. Northern Gaul, where the Frankish aristocracy was concentrated, saw the establishment of 230 of these monasteries. Monasteries became centers of power, often located in rural areas, and they played a crucial role in the political and social landscape. This shift was reflected in the saints' lives written during this period, with 77% of them originating in the north, compared to just 37% in the 6th century. The rise of monasticism and the ruralization of power marked a significant departure from the episcopal culture of the late and post-Roman periods. The episcopal families, who had been so closely tied to the urban and civic order, were giving way to a new kind of aristocracy that was rooted in the countryside. This new aristocracy was defined not by the old civic institutions, but by the rural estates and the monasteries that often accompanied them. In this new order, kinship and family were redefined. The extended Germanic family, which had been a fundamental unit of social and political order, was evolving. The new aristocratic families were more focused on monastic and rural centers of power, and their identities were shaped by these institutions rather than the old urban and episcopal tradition. This transformation was not just a matter of changing institutions. It was a reconfiguration of how people understood their place in the world and their connections to each other. The 7th century, therefore, was a pivotal period in the history of post-Roman Gaul. It saw the passing of an old order and the emergence of a new one, where the Frankish aristocracy, supported by monasticism and rural power, came to dominate the landscape. This new order was marked by a different way of thinking about family, power, and identity, one that would shape the future of medieval Europe.